G'day chemistry students. In this video we are looking at dot points 7.6.1 and 2. Our focus is on a new type of organic chemical called polymers, and they're formed through the process of polymerization. The purpose of this first video is to be looking at those different types of polymers, addition and condensation, and how they're formed. Let's get into it. So first off, let's talk about what a polymer actually is. Some are man-made, and we know them generally as plastics. Some are naturally occurring, made by both plants and animals. For man-made polymers, our plastics, they can be made from lots and lots and lots of different organic materials. That leads to them having different properties and uses. We can see 7 general categories there, but the range of polymers that can be produced synthetically are wide and diverse. As well, we have lots of naturally made polymers, say by an animal or a plant. These are fibrous materials that are made by living things. Our focus is primarily going to be on man-made polymers. So first off, polymers and monomers. A polymer itself is the organic chemical that we are focused on and talking about in this section. These are organic compounds with really, really long carbon chains. What we can see here is a chain that has 6 carbons in length, but note that there is no end or termination point to what's being drawn here. Essentially, polymers are so long that we don't usually draw out the entire molecule itself. They may have tens of carbons in the chain, hundreds of carbons in the chain, or thousands of carbons in the chain. What's common to all of these really long polymers is that they are all made from what we call a monomer. Monomer meaning one, poly meaning multiple. One single monomer is able to come together with other monomers to form polymers. The monomer itself is the basic structure that makes up the entire polymer. So if I have one monomer here, combining with another monomer here, combining with another monomer here, and so on, when we get them to bond together, you end up forming this entire chain. So this is very similar to what we just saw on the other slide. This monomer here, ethylene, we usually call it ethene. That's just an older version of nomenclature being used there for the word ethylene. But these ethene molecules can come together to make a polymer. Here we call it polyethylene. Again, an older style of naming that hasn't really phased itself out. It would also be acceptable to call this polymer polyethene, referring back to the IUPAC name for the monomer, ethene there. What I wanted to note here in particular is that we can use a notation like this to imply that the polymer chain is longer than 4 carbons and extends out in both directions. How far it goes, we're not entirely sure. When we're looking at plastics and stuff, they don't all have exactly the same molecule size, so we don't usually characterize polymers in that way. We just say that they're a repeating chain of a rough length. Here I have the same set of polymer and monomer that we've looked at in the previous 2 slides. Again, ethene and polyethene. But what I want to note here is that this kind of notation is much more common. And again, identifying that the chain branches out in multiple directions. Generally speaking, we just put a single monomer in the center and close them around in square brackets. I wanted to also show you another type of polymer here, polyvinyl chloride. Very similar to the ethene monomer. The one difference is that one of our hydrogens has been substituted out for a chlorine. As such, the 2 polymers are slightly different in composition, and that will actually lead to a difference in properties. And this idea of different properties is going to be a major focus for this topic on polymers. So first off, one type of polymer that we have is an addition polymer. I've been showing you examples of those already. Just like when we were looking at addition reactions in organic chemistry, we see that a double bond is required for an addition reaction. That second bond is able to break and form new bonds. In this case, rather than adding substituents like hydrogens or hydroxides or halogens, instead the electrons in the double bond go to the carbon, one on either side, and are then present to form bonds between other monomers to form a long chain. So what we end up having is repeating units of the same original monomer. You'll notice that there are no longer double bonds anymore. That is because while we still have a single bond here, the electrons are now on either side, participating in bonds to actually make the polymer chain. And again, we can use this square bracket notation to represent what a polymer chain looks like. Now, the other type of polymers that we have and that we'll be looking at in this topic are condensation polymers. And the way that they form is slightly different. We still have a continuous chain of a monomer, but in this case, we note that there are completely different functional groups at play. So for example, if we look at this monomer here, we can see that it's called 2-hydroxypropanoic acid. It contains a carboxylic acid functional group as well as an alcohol functional group. The alcohol group of one monomer and the carboxylic acid group of another monomer are able to interact with each other in a very similar way to the esterification process that we learnt about a few videos ago. In this case, what we see is that the hydroxyl group on the carboxylic acid and the hydrogen on the hydroxyl group come together to form water as a byproduct, just like the esterification process. What that leaves us with is an oxygen on one of the monomers and a carbon on the other monomer, which now have available electrons to combine and bond together. And we see a bond similar here, here, and here. This is where the monomers have linked up together. So what we can see is that on each monomer, the carboxylic acid group is able to condense and link up with another monomer from the hydroxyl group side, and its hydroxyl group side is able to link up with the carboxylic acid functional group on another monomer on the other side of the molecule. We then have on this entire chain an open carboxylic acid group and an open hydroxyl group, which can also go through an esterification, or what we can also call a condensation process, to then continue to build on that chain and make the chain longer and longer and longer. What you'll notice as well is this particular group of condensation polymer is known as a polyester, meaning that, as we identified before, there's an esterification process happening because the monomer contains a carboxylic acid and a hydroxyl group, just like we saw with our carboxylic acids and alcohols in an esterification process. There are other ways that polyesters can form. Note here that we have two different kinds of monomers. We have a monomer which only contains hydroxyl groups, and we have a monomer which only contains carboxylic acid groups. Now, in this setup, what we have is a two monomer system to make our polyesters. The hydroxyl group is able to react with the carboxylic acid group, just like in the previous one. And what that means is that we have a repeating pattern of the hydroxyl monomer followed by the carboxylic acid monomer, and so on and so forth. Again, you can make a really long chain of repeating units. Just keep in mind that the repeating unit is going to be both of these monomers combined together, and that's what we see down the bottom. We have the hydroxyl side and we have the carboxylic acid side, making that single repeating unit. But again, there's going to be a hydroxyl group on the outside as well as a carboxylic acid group on the outside of this chain, so we can continue that condensation process and make the chain longer and longer. Now, polyesters are not the only kind of condensation polymers. We can actually have a very similar reaction process with amide instead of alcohols or hydroxyl groups. This comes to form polyamides, which are more commonly known as nylon. In this example here, I have a monomer which has an amide group as well as a carboxylic acid group. The carboxylic acid and the amide can go through a condensation process very similar to the polyesters. The hydroxyl group on the carboxylic acid and one of the hydrogens on the amine group form water. That then leads to the formation of a bond between the remaining carbon and nitrogen. Again, a similar process can happen in a two monomer system. So in this case, we have a monomer with only amide groups on the outsides. And again, we have a monomer group with carboxylic acids on the outsides. What that means is that the amide and carboxylic acid can react together, a condensation process occurs, and those two monomers combine. Again, we have this condensation process able to occur over and over and over again, meaning that we make a chain that's really, really long. Note as well that the monomer itself is a combination of the amine group and the carboxylic acid group. So while this isn't a massive part of our Module 7 syllabus, I did also want to highlight some natural polymers. For plants in particular, polymers that are formed come from glucose, which it produces via photosynthesis. Now, there are two isomers of glucose, alpha glucose and beta glucose. The major difference between the two of them is on this carbon here, and the position of the hydroxyl group, whether it's pointing up or pointing down. This actually has an impact on the kinds of polymers that it will form. You'll see here that cellulose has an alternating orientation of its intersecting bond, whereas starch here, they all point downwards. And that actually has a slight impact on its properties. We might spend a little bit of time in class discussing which type of glucose is used to make which of those polymers. Now, polymers that are made by animals are generally not made by glucose. It's not a supply of organic material that it has a lot of. Instead, polymers are generally made using proteins, which are a lot more complex than glucose or any of the other monomers that we've been looking at for synthetic chemistry. So yeah, not, again, a very large part of this course. Thank you very much, everyone. Now that we've got a little bit more of an understanding of what addition and condensation polymers are, in the next lesson and in the next video, our major focus is going to be on the properties of those polymers. We've seen different polymers. We know that they have different structures. We know that they have different functional groups in them. And we're going to be looking really closely at what that means for the properties of plastics and polymers themselves. But until then, have a good one.